so much for joining us on today's webinar on Indigenous children and literacy, connecting home and school. I would now like to invite Dr. Logan to share a couple of words, and then we can pass it on to the moderator after that.
Okay. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. I'll try to finish it fast because there's someone mowing the lawn next to my house, so I don't want the noise to bother you. Okay, anyway, first thing first is I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to spend their weekend with us. In Taylor's University, we have embarked on this journey of inclusive education for all, out of which we are spending significant effort in working with Indigenous community. It's not only part of our FRGS grant that we are working for the government in producing research centered around early literacy among Indigenous children, or Orang Asli in Malaysia. We are also having a strong initiative of early literacy with the initiative of our Baca Baca project, which many of you all are part of it, and I thank you for being part of the Baca Baca project. Indigenous education is very complicated. Unfortunately, it's marginalized around the world. It's studied as an archaeological experience rather than an active solution to the contemporary curriculum. To me, that is the sadness of all, because the contemporary curriculum has served its benefit in the terms of production, because it was created in the midst of industrial revolution. But now we have come to the point where we have produced so much that we are now detrimental to the world itself. And we need a curriculum that is centered around conservatism, conserving the world, conserving the planet. It's a very important issue, which is the Indigenous curriculum is very strong on. So the idea is, how do we then create an harmony between these two forms of curriculum approach, or at least the perspective of knowledge? So I would like to thank that, particularly Dr. Karen Martin, who has taken the trouble to join us from Australia. Dr. Karen Martin is a Ungol, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing it too much.
No offense.
Yeah, and
I accept it. I understand.
Yeah, Pit Jara woman. She has over 20 years of experience in higher education, lecturing in early childhood education, development, and learning Aboriginal studies, Aboriginal Australian studies. She has written several books and authored. She has played a major role in the Australian Aborigine, particularly pre-year 1 to year 1 curriculum in Southeast Asia, in Queensland, sorry. I would like to thank Dr. Surya for joining us, although and Dr. Surya is not new to Taylor's. She has participated in another occasion, and I hope that this tradition will continue. Dr. Surya is coming from Nottingham, Malaysia. And most importantly, I would like to thank my fellow researcher, Dr. Kamal from Department of Anthropology and Sociology from University of Malaya, who will be also moderating this session, and who has done extensive work with the Aborigine or Orang Asli community in Malaysia. I would like to thank three of you all for enlightening me and our colleagues, and particularly our students who are following this conversation vividly. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Hema.
Thank you very much, Dr. Logan, for that introduction as well. And now I think, Kama, would you like to take over and get started?
Thank you, Hema. So Dr. Logan has more or less introduced our speakers today. Just like to welcome Dr. Karen Martin and Dr. Surya to the forum today on Indigenous children and early literacy, connecting homes and school. Perhaps can I invite Dr. Karen perhaps to present for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll follow with Dr. Surya. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I hope that will work. Did that come up?
Yeah, loud and very clear.
Yes.
Okay. So now I'll start with the beginning. And now that I have a stronger understanding of the the purpose and the you know, what you would want to hear more of, because I you know, came in with some idea but not enough. But what I will do is skip through some of the slides that I've you'll see here, just so that I can hit those or flesh out those key points that will align more strongly with today's session. So in my language, yura, which means we see each other. It does not mean in English as in hello. So the images there, the one on the left, bottom left of the surf is from what's called my father's country or my father's ancestral lands. And the image on the right is from my mother's ancestral land. So that's a beautiful place called Carnarvon Gorge in the state of Queensland. You know, not sure how much familiarity you have with the states and territories of Australia, but my father's country is just outside of Brisbane. It's a small sand island in the state of Queensland. I want to begin by making a very strong statement that in Australia there are two Indigenous groups. So one is the larger Aboriginal peoples, and the other group, as you can see in the box to the top of that map of Australia, are the Torres Strait Islander people. They're a much smaller group. Now, the map you are seeing is a more recent representation of the Aboriginal language groups that are in Australia, but it was estimated at the time of British invasion that was somewhere between 260 and 280.
Dr. Karen, you have to change the slide. You are still showing the introduction slide.
Okay, so thank you, but yeah, it's showing on my screen. I know why. Maybe if I do this, that's the introduction, and that one.
We are still, I mean, I'm still observing your introduction.
Yeah, it hasn't changed. The slide.
Maybe we change to.
I'm up to you because, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have the technological skills.
No worries. Dr. Karen, maybe you could try what you call it, sharing again. It might just have hang for a bit.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and then start again.
Yeah.
Okay. How's that? Not yet. That.
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
very good. Very good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, everybody. So that's the map that represents those the current estimation of the Aboriginal language groups in Australia. I realised too what I was doing. I was using the not the toggle on the screen, but the toggle on the keyboard. Now, did that scroll?
Yes.
Yes.
It's scrolled. Yeah.
So this was just information about Australia's population, but basically the main point here is that the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population is 3.3% of Australia, and the childhood population aged under 15 is actually 33% of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, whereas in comparison to non-Aboriginal Australians, that age range is from 20 to 35 or 40, 20 to 40. So our younger children represent a significant amount of our population. Yeah. Okay, how did that one go? Did that scroll?
Yes, it did.
Okay,
Yes.
I realized I was using my keyboard, not the toggle on the thing. Okay, so what the images here now portray, there's a bit of a myth, even in Australia, that Aboriginal people only live in certain regions. But this map actually shows, and you can see by the darker blue colour scheme, that that's actually the highest density of the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians in Australia. So it's not in those remote types of areas. It's actually in major cities or regional towns. Now, again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the language status, because here's that image again of that language map. So therefore, if most Aboriginal people are living in major cities and towns, the main language spoken, first language, language 1, L1, is English or a variety of English. So we refer to that as Aboriginal English. But in terms of the older Aboriginal languages, it's estimated there's only 120 of those that are spoken compared to the 260 at the time of British invasions, but only 12 of those, which is quite an alarming figure, are classified as strong, which means that there's 2 or more generations fluently speak this language. So things are in a very, very dire situation, and they've certainly done a very, very good job of colonising us through education and then through the use of English languages, myself being included. I have very limited knowledge of only of my father's language. I was going to outline the context of early childhood education in Australia, but I think I'll skip forward, and I'm happy to make this available to you as a PDF. So, you know, if you're taking notes, you can have the images there as well. So from the work that I've been doing, my realization, and Dr. Logan, you know, touched on some of these aspects, you know, about the very strong, you know, contrast. It's just stronger than a contrast between an Indigenous world and then a colonial dominant world, which creates its own orthodoxy. Over a number of years of doing my own teaching, my own research and lecturing and listening and talking with others, this is the model that I think actually helps explain where things go wrong, but also where they go right. Because if we consider ourselves as in that yellow circle as this is our reality as Aboriginal Australians, then we are marginalised, absolutely. First of all, we're outnumbered, only 3.3% of the population. So, but the rest of the Australian society actually doesn't have Aboriginal people do not feature highly in their minds, in their days. In fact, most of them have never met or spoken with at length or over time an Aboriginal person, and that's certified from research that could be. So our own EC programs that are Aboriginal controlled sit within those realities, because it's kind of recognising the best of both worlds for our children. We want the best of those both worlds. However, when they start that big journey into the schooling sector, some very, that's where the colonialism and I'm going to put it this way, the violences that are perpetuated in various kinds of ways, particularly through how our children, how any child is viewed, but particularly our children, and then also how schooling itself operates as a Western structure, because it's a structure that's there to promote meritocracy. And meritocracy is based on, you know, being well-resourced. And some of the people in Australia have been well-resourced because they exploited Aboriginal Australians. So I'm going to skip through because I want to focus on 2 points of research that I've been involved in. One is from what's called the longitudinal study of Indigenous children in Australia. And what happens is that there were 2 waves, and this has been operating since 2008, where we got our first wave, and we asked questions of the child, which is we had to fight the government to be able to do this, because as Aboriginal people, we believe our children have agency. And if we don't ask them, then we won't actually know how they're experiencing something. So we also ask questions of their main parent or carer, and we also ask questions of their teachers. And we've got data that follows some 1,600 children in one cohort and 1,200 children in another cohort, all the way through their educational journey. Most of them are now in senior secondary, year 11 and 12. So we, in terms of literacy, we asked the parents what they wanted, and here's some their qualitative responses. And if you take a look at these, it's exactly the same sort of thing that you might ask the same number of any kind of parent. They want them to read okay. They want them to spell and write and count better. They want them to write their name. There's nothing of a surprise there. However, some people would tend to believe that Aboriginal people don't care. Their parents don't care about and therefore they don't hold expectations for their children. This study has certainly disproved that in multiple points in times. Now, this is also what we asked the parents what they expected of their child as they started to enter into the school year. And again, some of these, you know, if you read these, you would say, well, are these Aboriginal people? Couldn't they be anybody? And the point again is, yes, those parents, our parents, have the same expectations as any parent for their children. But the big takeaway message is they have the expectations. The issue comes when they get into school and the schooling system, you know, impinges on teachers to actually be able to see and have the time to ask parents and ask them effectively, what do you want for your child? In fact, sometimes in schools, and I've seen this happen in Australia, when the children get to school, the teachers tend to think, okay, tabula rasa, this child knows nothing. I have to skill him or her up from here. So whatever those child brings into the schooling setting is of no interest or no value once that curriculum in the schooling setting starts. It would be remiss of me not to include what the children's voices were actually saying. So their favourite things to do at preschool, and again, it's not no-brainer, they love to play or they love to draw and paint. But look at the ones they also refer to, they like to write, they like to read books, they like to use computers, and they like to play with their friends. There are many people in Australia who would not believe that Aboriginal children have an interest in those early literacy experiences, such as reading books or playing with computers, or even an interest in writing. But this study actually proved that they do. This image actually reinforces that point that at preschool, it's early childhood years, it's child focused, but once they get into preschool, this is what this study found, identified that it's learner focused, but once they get into the formal compulsory schooling, it becomes curriculum focused. So it becomes less about the child, and therein comes the the tensions and the experiences actually impact on children, especially if they understand this teacher does not actually realize I already know some things. So instead of the teacher building on, the teacher thinks they're starting with a blank slate. And the implications are not just for the teachers, they're for the parents and carers, because we have data that says parents are actually okay to talk with teachers in those preschool years, so prior to compulsory schooling, but once they hit schooling, the formal compulsory schooling years, the parents feel less able or less comfortable to talk to their child's teacher. And I've just explained some aspects there of the teacher and of themselves. So here we go. This was my attempt to get to people to reconceptualize these educational journeys as a journey in context, and that just because we start to go to school, does not mean we stop being Aboriginal or we lose Aboriginal. It does mean it impinges them, and we have to work harder to support and scaffold and nurture our children into that identity, including their language. But in terms of the teaching, and I also talked to the school leadership of the image on the right-hand side there, that the X factors that I actually found are about praxis. So praxis is theory in action or action theory. It depends. Now, it's particularly about the context. So these are all words with an X in it. And it's also about the experiences of the teachers before they come, the children before they come to school, the parents before they come to school, and the principals and the school leadership as well. And equally about their expectations. Because I have heard so many stories from Aboriginal parents where they were fully aware that their teacher had low expectations of their child and also had negative expectations of them, as in discriminatory attitudes towards them as parents. So I guess my big takeaway message is when we can get those 4 X factors working well, then we're on a really good way to having a productive educational journey that does not erase the identity or does not cause trauma or does not perpetuate those continual violences as these colonial structures can on our children. Now, I'd like to share with you the journey about what happens to them when they get into secondary school, but oh my goodness, that actually traumatizes me talking about it. So I'm going to finish where I started with the closing of the word, which means ure. So first we see each other, ura. Now it's ure, which means see you next time, because there's no goodbye. There's actually this notion of this will continue in some way, shape or form. Doesn't have to be physical, but it could be in our thoughts. It could be when we read each other's work in any way, shape and form that way. And again, the 2 representations of my ancestry and my identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karen. Thank you. That was a lot to take in a very short time. If I were to attempt at summarizing, it's education as a colonizing tool. Your studies have demonstrated the stereotypes on Aboriginal children and parents through schooling is not founded, and that your work is moving towards trying to find a way so that education doesn't de-indigenize.
Yeah. Thank you. Well done. Well done.
Okay, I've got a lot of questions I'm really interested to ask, but I think we will go to Surya first, Dr. Surya, and then I will revisit, especially the secondary education that was very troubling. Sorry, but I think there's a lot of things that we will see that are common as well, and it's just so much. I think we would want to ask as well. Yes, Dr. Surya, perhaps we can invite you. So also Dr. Logan has done a good job in introducing Dr. Surya. I'll just pass the mic to her. Dr. Surya. We can't hear you, Dr. Surya. I think your mic is off. Is muted.
Okay. I think it's unmuted now.
Yeah, can hear you. All good.
Sorry, I'm so used to using Microsoft Teams and I'm struggling using Zoom because I rarely use Zoom. So, all right. Apologies.
No worries. Take your time.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Be able to see my screen, yeah?
Jen, try and move it down so we see whether it goes to the next slide.
Hang on, yeah, because at the moment...
It's on the first slide.
Okay, just give me... Okay, let me unshare and let me try again, yeah? Because I think what's wrong, but... Okay. Can you see that on your screen?
I can still see the first slide. Maybe we try the second. Let's see what happens.
Or perhaps change it to presentation mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just give me a moment because I've lost my Zoom page for some reason and I cannot find it. So I cannot see.
Oh no, I think you just see your you'll just see your screen. You'll just see your slides.
Okay, now I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you see my presentation mode now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can.
Okay, so maybe to help with the connection, I will turn off my video. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for having me today, and I'd like to thank Dr. Karen for her very insightful sharing. Like Kamal mentioned earlier, a lot of things that Dr. Karen mentioned in her presentation, the experiences that I went through as an Orang Asli child, and also the experiences of many Orang Asli children today as well. So to proceed with the presentation, my presentation today will look at Orang Asli children and early literacy. And my focus would be to connect home and school practices using this concept called dominant language constellations, or DLC. Okay, so just a little bit on the context. I'm not going to spend much time on this. So the Orang Asli literally means original people, are the indigenous peoples of Peninsular Malaysia. So there are about 0.7% of us in the population, in the Malaysian population. And one important point that I would like to highlight here is that although most people believe that the Orang Asli of Malaysia is a homogeneous group, but we actually come from 18 different sub-ethnic groups. So as you can see on the screen, I've listed the 18 subgroups, sub-ethnic groups of Orang Asli. The reason why I'm making it a point to mention this is because at the moment, we have this misunderstanding that the needs of all Orang Asli students are similar or exactly the same. Because of the misunderstanding that most people think all Orang Asli students come from one same group, then a lot of programs tend to focus on specific groups, or most probably the biggest groups of Orang Asli in Malaysia. So by knowing that there are different sub-ethnic groups, it is also good to know that all these sub-ethnic groups, not all of us live in the jungle. So we live in different settings, so different environments. We have Orang Asli communities in the interiors, in the jungle. We have those in the remote areas, in the villages, and we also have Orang Asli who live near townships. So because the geographical factors of our Orang Asli students, or students in general, play an important role in the effectiveness of any interventions or programs designed for the group of students. That's why it is quite important for us to be aware that not all Orang Asli, in contrast to what many people believe, not all Orang Asli actually come from the jungle or reside in the jungle. So moving forward, I think this is common. This is to some level universal to the international indigenous communities, where we are struggling with poverty, dispossession of lands, where we don't actually have our land rights. And in education, we have high dropout rates, low education attainment, and also the stigmatization of our cultures and identities, not only in the school settings, but in the society in general. Okay, so moving on to Orang Asli children's literacy, I'm going to just I'm just highlighting this definition of literacy from UNESCO. I'm not going to read everything here. The part that I would like to highlight here is that, as you can see here, sorry, can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because I can hear. I thought somebody couldn't hear.
I think somebody's mic must have just.
Zoom 需要翻墙。
Could you please turn off our mics? Yes,
Okay.
Surya, back to you.
Okay, so the point that I would like to highlight here is that literacy is supposed to enable us to develop our knowledge and potential, and to participate fully in our communities and also the wider community. In other words, I would like to say here that for us, the Orang Asli, in this 21st century, we want to be able to be in both worlds, in our indigenous world and also in the mainstream world, if you would prefer the term mainstream. So in contrast to what many people believe, that we want to, or we should be in our natural or our traditional setting alone, we actually, based on the data that we've collected from children, parents, right? Many Orang Asli children, many Orang Asli parents actually want to be able to navigate both worlds effectively, and to be given fair opportunities to do well in both worlds and not to be discriminated. And Another point, interesting point to raise here is that some factors influencing literacy levels are gender and language, and also the help that we are getting. And also there are also power, hierarchy, and also the, by power here, it means in our Orang Asli context, we are referring to the power imbalance between schools and home settings, or school authorities and parents or students themselves. So here are some, if you can see on your left here, here are some programs that have been implemented. There are many other programs, but I'm just highlighting a few ones here. I think the first one is the most popular one, Linus, but it is the screening of literacy and numeracy program that was implemented in all schools but abolished in 2019. And we also have programs involving rural community learning centers. And also the latest one is the Tech ICT Literacy Program, which is a collaboration between different government agencies. So, and the current scenarios, as you can see here, the current literature highlights some issues which are obviously, I think we are all aware of the fact that our literacy rates are much lower compared to our counterparts or students from other ethnic groups. And then some studies, for example, the one that I've cited here, found that in terms of this major program, the Linus program, teachers are not well trained to deliver the program. And there are also other factors such as many Orang Asli children do not have the opportunity to attend preschools, affecting their literacy in later stage of schooling, and also some start formal schooling and at an older age. And parents are not able to support children's learning because some parents are also illiterate, so they are not able to provide support support to their children in the home environment. So recent studies have also highlighted, I think the studies that I've cited here, this is Dr. Hema's and Dr. Kamal's study as well. So perhaps later on you could share more about this. And the recent studies found that the link between home and school literacy practices has not been widely explored. So just a little bit on the decolonization of Orang Asli education. So this is a study conducted by Dr. Hema. I think as I was reading the study, I feel that this study this study is timely because the writing has highlighted this issue of decolonization, which is not being widely discussed or spoken in the context of Orang Asli education. So probably later on, Dr. Hema and Dr. Kamal can actually enlighten us furthermore, I mean, in terms of this study. But what I would like to highlight here is the findings of the study that suggest or recommend us to revisit the assumed knowledge that Orang Asli should acquire. That means that to revisit our interpretation or our assumption that there are certain sets of skills or contents or values that need to be taught in schools without considering the needs or without considering what Orang Asli communities and what Orang Asli children actually want and need to excel in both worlds, the indigenous worlds and also non-indigenous worlds. And this involves examining the challenges that Orang Asli children face in learning literacy in schools, and also we need to contextualize language education that considers our Orang Asli children's experiences and environment. So in the next part of my presentation, I will propose how we can actually contextualize, how we can actually better understand the language environment of Orang Asli children by using this framework called the dominant language constellation. Yeah, this is one of the frameworks that I feel like would be useful for us to connect the home and school literacy practices. So very quickly here, Professor Aranin has developed this idea concept of dominant language constellations, and DLC, I would refer to it as DLC. DLC is the group of the most important languages that function as an entire unit. So for multilingual speakers, if you speak more than one language, then you will have like a group of dominant languages that function together for you to meet the communicative purposes of communicative demands in your wider environment. So in the constellation, or in the group, there will be different languages, what we call member languages. So these member languages could be our international language, our regional language, or state language, or minority language. In the context of Orang Asli children or Orang Asli students, or Asli communities, that would mostly involve, among others, right, that would mostly involve international language, English, national language, Malay, and also our minority language or home language, our own Orang Asli languages. By the way, I forgot to mention in my introduction earlier that our Orang Asli sub-ethnic groups, we speak different languages. So Orang Asli children from different sub-ethnic backgrounds will come with different languages altogether. So these member languages, the main languages that you have together in your constellation, these languages actually, they interact and they accommodate each other to fulfill what functions are, to fulfill functions of communications, what you are trying to achieve in that particular setting. So in other words, the way we use our languages is not really, it is more fluid. Like we don't exactly segregate the languages, but they are together integrated into one system. And more often than not, our selection of languages, or our decision to choose which language to use in a particular environment or a particular interaction, most of the time it is automatic, and because you're so used to the environment, you know, you have learned, you have studied, you are familiar with the different factors in the language environment, and you can make automatic decisions to which language you would like to use in a particular instruction. So what I'm showing here is the DLC maps of Orang Asli students. I'm going to share two maps here for today's presentation. So this is based on the data that were collected from my study, and these the maps that you will see are informed by the data collected from and by Orang Asli students. In some cases, we also had our Orang Asli students themselves collecting data and selecting which part of information that they would like to share with the wider public. So the data that informed our maps, our DLC maps of Orang Asli students came from the language use survey, individual interviews, photo voice project, and sharing circles that we conducted with 194 Orang Asli students. As you can see here, there are many languages in the map, in the DLC map of most Orang Asli students. The first map represents the DLC of most of the participating students, most of the 194 students that took part in this study. So as you can see here, the one in the middle here, you can see 3 stars in the inner circle. This is the languages of DLC. These are the member languages, the vehicle languages, the most dominant languages in the language environment of Orang Asli students, of these Orang Asli students. Most of them will have Orang Asli their own Orang Asli language, Malay, and also English in the DLC as their dominant languages, as their vehicle languages. So these languages, they use this often, and the most based on the data, the most prominent or the most dominant language is actually Malay, because they use Malay in different domains. And Orang Asli languages are usually limited to home domains only. And sadly, our Orang Asli languages are being stigmatized, and our Orang Asli children are feeling it a bit conscious to use Orang Asli languages in public because of the stigmatization and also discrimination that they will face once they speak their languages or once they sound Orang Asli. So, and a lot of students and parents as well place a really high importance on English language because they feel that English will help them to, English will be a capital like that can help them improve their socioeconomic status. And also to help their students excel in education. So as you can see here, stars on the orbit here, these are the languages that the children know. They don't necessarily speak the languages fully or fluently, but they know some words, they know some phrases, they know some sentences, they probably can understand a little bit. So it's quite interesting because this data were also collected from, by and from Orang Asli groups or Orang Asli children who lived in the interior. But it's interesting to see that they had, sorry, not the interior, in the remote areas, all right? It's interesting to see that even though that they do not necessarily have any direct contact or they do not know any Korean person, for example, in real life, but they do have some knowledge of these languages because of the exposure that they get from the media, especially television and also nowadays the internet. So they really enjoy watching Korean series, Indonesian movies, and they are also familiar with Arabic because of the influence of Islam as an official religion in Malaysia. And also they also know Chinese as well. So they don't necessarily speak all these languages on the orbit fluently, but they can understand to some extent and they can produce a language as well. And then stars at the corner here are the languages that they encounter in the wider community. So there are other Orang Asli languages, for example, Amatemia. So outside my DLC, there are other languages that I know, Semai, Jakon, Temuan, that I do not necessarily understand. I do not understand those languages. I don't speak those languages, but they are there and I'm aware of that. And some say Japanese, Thai, and Tamil as well. And as you can see here, stars at the top here are languages that the students are aware of to some degree. So they know there is a language called Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, French. So mostly because of what they learn from school and also what they watch in the media as well. So this is what the DLC map of most of the students in this study look like. And some students also have a slightly different map. So as you can see here, the difference here is some students, right, which is amazing, I would say. Right, some students actually have up to 4 languages in their DLC. So they have their Orang Asli language, Malay, Chinese, and English as well. So these are the languages that they are fluent in, and they're really proficient in these languages. They are able to communicate and to function using these languages. These are the vehicle languages for them. And one of the reasons that we found with the additional Chinese language here, mostly Mandarin and Cantonese, because some actually went to Chinese kindergarten or Chinese schools. And this is also the result of intercultural marriages as well. So they speak Chinese at home as a home language as well. So it is wonderful to see that even though in the traditionally or in the literature, I mean, at least in the past, that we always hear, we used to hear things like Orang Asli children are not capable of, doing well in school because they are limited in academic abilities. But it's interesting to see that how they have been able to manage multiple languages all at once in their language environments, and for some reason we have not highlighted this enough. I think this is a talent, this is a great ability that our Orang Asli children have, but because of other external factors that are not directly related to their language environment or their language abilities in this sense, their talents or the abilities to actually master and manage so many languages, multiple languages like this, have not been highlighted enough. So The reason why I'm highlighting this DLC as a way to connect the home and school literacy practices is that I think it is necessary for teachers, researchers, researchers, policymakers, and also practitioners, everyone involved, all stakeholders, to actually be aware of the complexity and the strengths of our Orang Asli students' language environment when they are dealing or when they're developing, delivering any literacy or language programs for the Orang Asli children, especially now that we are talking about making education more inclusive for our Orang Asli children. So as Professor Lobianco states here, by using DLC, dominant language constellation, we can actually have a representation of the specific clusters of languages. Like I showed earlier, you could see that in the first map, the cluster includes Malay, English, and also the home language of Orang Asli language. And in the second map, there is an additional language in the cluster, which is Chinese. It could be Mandarin or Cantonese. So by using DLC, we can also help teachers and researchers and policymakers as well to understand the impact that multilingual has on education. And it also helps us to move away from the stereotypes that Orang Asli students, especially the young generations now, are not aware of what's going on in the non-Orang Asli worlds, because the data that we have gathered show that our Orang Asli children know what's going on in the non-Indigenous world, and they also want to be part of it. And most of the exposure actually comes from the media, which is impossible for us to control, and we don't want to control that either, right? We don't want to control that. But what I'm trying to highlight here is it is happening, and we need to take that into consideration when we develop programs or when we develop policies for the Orang Asli children. We need to move away from the ideas that Orang Asli children or Orang Asli students need to be in that traditional setting only, because that will be an unjust approach, because then we will not be able to prepare Orang Asli children to be able to navigate both worlds effectively in their future. So it also helps us to build a particular student's linguistic profile so that teachers will understand this better, and it helps us understand the reality of an Orang Asli student's life, so that we are aware that in their home settings, their literacy practices are different, language practices are different. They have certain tendencies to use certain languages in a particular interaction, and this will help us have a clearer link between home and school practices. At the moment, I'm not aware of any other studies trying to map the language use or language practices or literacy practices of Orang Asli children in this manner using DLC. And this study, the map that I showed you earlier, are only based on 194 students. So it would be great if we could have more, studies looking into this complex language environment, and then we can actually come with certain recommendations that are actually in line with what is actually going on in their real life setting. So I'm not going to focus on this because I think we don't have much time left. Dr. Kamal, do we have how many minutes do I have left?
You sort of passed through your 15, but maybe we can give another 3 or so minutes.
Okay, so very quickly, this is another practical way that teachers can actually apply in their classroom setting. This is what Professor Aaron calls streamlining of affordances, meaning we streamline or we select, we identify the desired factors or the factors that will contribute or will support students' learning, and also the constraining factors that will not or that will hinder students from learning more effectively. So by streamlining, by actively or by by streamlining, by really identifying these factors, we can design our lessons to be more culturally responsive and to be responsive to the needs of that particular group of students. So this is an example of how an inventory of affordances for oral Asli children would look like. For this one, I'm just showing the inventory for oral Asli languages and also Malay, but I'm not going to look at this in detail. So by actually identifying what are the strengths or what are the desired affordances and what are the disabling affordances, we can actually help oral Asli students capitalize on their strengths, and we can actually help to find ways to mitigate those disabling affordances. And as for the conclusion, so this is the definition that I highlighted earlier in the introduction. And for the oral Asli children, there is an urgent need for literacy education or language education or education in general to consider our children's lived experiences and our linguistic landscapes, which are quite complex, based on empirical studies, based on recent literature, because a lot of things that are happening in the ground, in the real life, or a lot of programs have been designed based on assumptions, based on outdated understandings of oral Asli cultures, oral Asli communities, and also misinterpretation of our identities and cultures. So one of the frameworks that we can use is the DLC framework that I showed earlier. So hopefully this will help teachers, will help us researchers, teachers, practitioners, policymakers to understand the language environment of oral Asli students better. All right, that's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kamal. Over to you.
Thank you, Surya. Let me just, shall we stop, Shah? Yeah, okay, thanks, Surya. Again, if I wanted to summarize it, the key points that I took away from it, at least, was that it's a critique of policy in how generally we homogenize, we assume oral Asli is a homogenized community, when in reality they are a heterogeneous community, not just in culture, religion, language, but also in terms of location. So lots of times we talk about oral Asli, we assume that they are all living in forested areas, but you know, I think if we were to map oral Asli communities today, we'll find many also in urban areas, in the peripheral areas, in coastal, but also there's also economic diversity. So while there is the common experience of being marginalized from land and not having recognition of a customary land, there's also lots of diversity today among oral Asli, and I think Dr. Surya has pointed out that this has to be taken into account in talking about when planners come together to design the materials. And Dr. Surya also elaborated from her study on the DCL to show that oral Asli, to also dispel the idea that oral Asli is somewhat ignorant or naive of the world outside. The diversity in the languages that they speak as their what was that word, in their DCL, reflects how much engaged they are in the wider world. And really, I mean, with social media today, you can just go on Facebook and Twitter and all that, and there's so many oral Asli chat groups, social media presence, and very much engaged, not just in oral Asli issues related to the immediate like land, but also on a host of things. TikTok, for example, is a very popular medium today. And it was used to engage oral Asli in addressing COVID, for example. One way the oral Asli community got the message out about COVID, got people to think about vaccination was through the social media. So her study also disproves a common stereotype about the oral Asli. And she also feels that it is important for all stakeholders working with oral Asli to recognize this language diversity. And then she ends it by talking about looking at enabling factors to optimize learning. I'll stop there. Okay, so I think, Hema, shall we open up for questions?
Yes, I think we can start with some questions and then we can continue with Karen and Surya.
Okay. Okay. Shall we open it to the audience? Anyone would like? There's 110 people here. Is there anyone who would perhaps want? If you could raise your hand and maybe unmute yourself and ask your question.
Or they can also come out, maybe they can also type in the chat box. We also have close to 30 people here, physical and campus,
Okay.
in of 149, 150 people joining us today. So either in the chat box or they can unmute and ask you.
Yeah, either one.
Anyone here have any questions as well?
Yeah, I will start off with a question.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Logan.
So this question goes to both Karen and Surya because they come from different geographical contexts. I mean, I'm going to sound very naive because honestly, it's something that I don't understand. So I'm going to bring it out the way it is. In 100 years from now, would we still be sitting around and talking about Aboriginal or Indigenous education? As I said, to me, as I said, I'm new to this field. Historically, I'm a maths educator. So I always wondered in the conversations I had with Prof. Moses and Hema and all, when things gradually evolve or when we are colonized, would we be colonized to a point where this thing will be missing from the social and historical landscape?
Can I respond? Just something and big.
Please do.
And a key one. And there's so I'm gonna I can't not but answer on a personal level, but also a professional one. In thinking that I hope not. I hope the work that we're all doing, you know, and also our predecessors. So I'm probably in Australia amongst the first actual wave of when the major policy shift happens to, you know, where that social justice came about more strongly. And as the nature of politics and policies and governance and governing happens, when I consider what I experienced and look at what my nephews and younger children are experiencing, I see how privileged I am in this way, shape, and form, which drives my impetus to keep contributing. In one sense, I hope we still are having conversations, but in the big sense, I hope that those conversations and those policies are actually more driven from us and our people. We need and our way of understanding and seeing and being in the world, because that Western colonized orthodoxy or neoliberalism, it's making us all unwell. It's making our brains unwell. And First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, have that other way of seeing and understanding. So I hope we then have a critical mass, because I don't think our numbers are actually going to, you know, increase exponentially in 100 years to be able to maintain that change. But gosh, I hope it's going to be better than, because I turned 60 this year, yay! And as an Aboriginal Australian woman, I've been having these same kind of conversations for 40 years, and I don't want that to continue for another 40 years if I happen to be alive, or whichever the case. That's why I'm so pleased to hear about the work, and Dr. Surya, thank you. That has just enlivened my neurons. I'm thinking, thank you. Here's this other way of understanding how things can be done. We need that here in Australia. I love to talk, so I'll close with that point and saying, yes, we still do need to be taking it, but we need to be driving those changes. We need to have that critical mass in 100 years.
Surya?
Thank you, Dr. Karen. I do agree with you, especially when you say that in 100 years' time, I hope we don't have to wait 100 years though. I hope soon enough we can be the ones driving the policy or driving the conversation. Or in other words, I hope that the power imbalance that we are experiencing in many sectors, not only education, can be mitigated, and so that our voices can be highlighted accordingly, especially in matters related to Indigenous education, Indigenous issues. Then a lot of policies, a lot of programs have been designed by non-Indigenous peoples, non-Orang Asli, which is to some extent is great, but there are also misunderstandings, misinterpretations, or probably some gaps that need to be bridged there. And I think it's not just either or. It's not just, you know, it has to be us together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in general. So I think in the context of Malaysian education system now, a lot of the interventions, a lot of the programs have been focusing on the Orang Asli children alone, or the Orang Asli communities, or the Orang Asli parents. It's almost like the burden or the effort of making lives better for us, the Orang Asli, the Indigenous peoples of Malaysia, solely or only fall upon us. Whereas where we are today is a result of multiple waves of colonization. And I think when talking about Indigenous education, we also need to mention the internal colonization as well, which is something that is quite sensitive or difficult for us to talk about, especially in our country now. But the conversation has to take place somehow. I think by coming together like this, by learning from each other, for example, me learning from Dr. Karen, who has much more experience in this, and it's interesting that for somehow we actually share similar experiences, and I think yes, and I could actually feel what you when you it's like, oh my God,
likewise.
Yes, and so I think by learning from each other this way, and also by having platforms like this, by having support from the non-Indigenous communities as well, we should have more conversations like this, and we should talk about how we can bridge the gap, and the fact that making education or making life in general better for the Indigenous peoples, that does not only up to the Orang Asli or Indigenous people, Indigenous communities alone. Yeah, thank you.
To extend that, sorry, Kamal, because to extend that, currently from my perspective, we are trying to understand the past. We are trying to live in the present by understanding the past. But is the future an extrapolation of the past? I mean, do you see, just like every other thing that assuming we all believe in some form of evolution, do you see communities evolving, and therefore the current reality may, or at least our current understanding needs to evolve? Because there is an inherent desire within any community, whether it's the Pueblo in North America or the Amazonians, there is a natural desire among the communities to evolve. So that's my big challenge. Are we trying to preserve the past or guide the evolution?
Can I say something before I forget? So just a few years ago, I was in a village of a people who are semi-nomadic. They're called the Jahai. They live in the northernmost of the peninsula. And this man was asking me, in 20 years, Kamal, where do you see your children, if you have any? I'm not married, I don't have children. But he said, imagine you have children. Where do you see your children in 20 years? And he goes, where do you see my grandchildren in 20 years? You know, will my grandchildren be doing the same thing I'm doing? And will your grandchildren go so far ahead? And then he talks, and he also had another conversation we had about education. He says, why is it that when I went to school and there was only up to standard 3, and they were taught by the Department of Orang Asli officers, they could read. But today his kids go to a government school under the Ministry of Education and they can't read. I don't think it's a question of evolution. I think it's a question of recognizing needs. But that's just my take on it. Yeah, sorry, Dr. Karen.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting question. I'm tending to agree. It may not be about evolution, particularly if we take on board, you know, the Western constructs of who we are and that their notion of evolution, because from an Aboriginal Australian perspective, we were always incorporating knowledge and change. In fact, it's a life form edict, a part of our ontology and our epistemology, to preempt and prepare for change. And that's how we survived, because I'm living in a region that's just been hammered by two massive floods in the 1 month. Now, I'm not affected by that, but my Aboriginal knowledge would say, don't live near the river, especially if it's in a rainy community. So there are those geographical nuances. But I think that there's a notion of First Peoples, and I'll use that word term, you know, to encompass, and I don't mean to be offensive with that, but First Peoples level of intellect has never been effectively understood using Western constructs of intelligence. In fact, there's a point, I believe, where, and I'm trying to understand it myself, where that, because Aboriginal knowledge is always referred to as Aboriginal culture. Now, and I'm trying to reintroduce to people and saying, no, that's not your culture, it's your knowledge form. It comes from somewhere, and as the model of the DLC showed, that there are always those interactions with people, places, spaces, and ideas and experiences, and we are always moving with them and incorporating them, deciding, making decisions about which ones are more urgent or which ones we connect. And from an Aboriginal Australian perspective, it's why we never bureaucratized our knowledge by putting it in a script, i.e. English. We embedded that knowledge amongst each other, but also amongst our physical and environment, and that, which challenged us to be able to get back together to share those insights that each of us held. And that's the way that knowledge process works. So will that be around in 20 years? This is the bit that worries me, because when people try to store or use particular ICTs on capturing those types of knowledge, to me it comes out two-dimensional. They can never get the nuances. They can never get the bit that fires up the neurons, the bit that, you know, causes someone like me to wave my hands around in excitement. They're a start. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. They're a start, but it will always be a necessity that we get together as people and we talk through the layers, and we don't come up with one single answer. We come up with an understanding of these are the messages that are the focus for me now. The story is still there. The story is still real. I can come back to that to ascertain other layers of the knowledge as I need it, and as I understand that other people might be valued from that. So if we continue to overutilize those dominant definitions by those Western disciplines like anthropology, then yes, we are doomed. You know, and I challenge people to say, why would, when you go fishing, why do you call that a cultural practice when a white man goes, your neighbour goes fishing, and he just calls it fishing? Why make the distinction? Unless that person is, who's the Aboriginal person, is actually going to do some reconnecting with his ancestral lands. But that's not a cultural practice. That's just a way of being.
And it's very practical and applied knowledge that adapts to, you know, we have climate change now, right? And like my friends again, the Sami hunter-gatherers are very aware of the changing in climate, and they talk about that. but land, as you mentioned just now, customary land is so central to that conversation, to that
Yes.
ability to adapt, you know. Yeah. Sorry, Dr. Surya, do you have?
I think Dr. Kamal and Dr. Karen have actually explained it well. And thank you, Dr. Karen, for highlighting the fact that, you know, I'm interested with the use of knowledge instead of cultures. I myself have been using cultures more often than knowledge, but yeah, listening to you, yeah, it's knowledge. It's not only culture, it's knowledge. We got it from somewhere. It's what we know. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes, yes, yeah. It's knowledge, it's philosophy, it's that, it's, you know, now I'm using those same dominant terms, but that's all I have. But it occurs to me that something for Aboriginal Australians kept us alive, you know, in spite of those waves of violences. And by the time the British got to Australia, they had that machinery of invading and colonising down pat. Australia and New Zealand were one of the last two in terms of the British. So you know, they came in and, you know, just came in like a tsunami, and yet we survived. And I was always curious, how did that happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? So that's where it's driven me to these points. And I have been blessed to be able to sit alongside many Aboriginal people and knowledgeable non-Aboriginal people too, who are able to think through the layers, not just take for granted, you know, particular words or particular terms, that they're scholars and of high intellect, even if in spite of some of them not being able to read or write English.
Thank you, Dr. Karen. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and anyone else would like to ask a question?
Hi. Hello, my name is Tarini. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Kamal and everyone else. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So talking about culture, knowledge, and also Dr. Kamal talking about, you know, meeting the needs of people. Like, for example, they are not being able to read under the Ministry of Education, but when they were, you know, having like his grandfather were able to read, even though it wasn't under the Ministry of Education. So in literacy development, right, people, there are a lot of studies that say that it needs to be very closely aligned with socio-cultural of where the children are coming from. So how are we going to make sure that these are incorporated in schools or, you know, in terms of education, so that these children make sense of what they are reading? Because they come from, as Dr. Logan always likes to say, you know, a child from urban, like Bangsa, would read differently compared to a child from Broga. So in that case, how do we handle literacy development, or what is your take on that alongside socio-cultural? Or you can also talk about like what's going to be the biggest issue moving forward, because I'm not sure. While I'm here to contribute, will I see the changes in classrooms? I'm not sure. Maybe when I'm gone, probably we will have all these changes. But what do you think is going to be the biggest issue as educators or researchers to bring this to the classroom?
Dr. Karen, perhaps?
Yeah, in the Australian context, we now have a national curriculum. And I think it's been in operation for maybe 8 years. And I can actually say that some schools in some places are still struggling in how to, you know, catch up. When I see the English curriculum there, I despair, because the impact that will have on teachers is to teach in a disciplinary way. And it will take a very experienced and skilled and knowledgeable teacher to actually understand how to work at that interface between the curriculum and the learners in their classroom. And I made the comment earlier about, you know, my further disdain about what happens in secondary schooling. I think it might be similar. I don't want to take that for granted, but in the Australian context, primary schooling, you have the same teacher and the same classmates all day. Secondary schooling, that can shift sometimes, but you have a different teacher every 40 odd minutes or so, and but sometimes 80 minutes. When you get to secondary schooling, you're also working with youth who are in these quite delicate, I'm going to name it as delicate stages of their growth and understanding. In fact, they're amped up 3-year-olds with a big attitude and lots of vocab to go with it. That's how I see 13-year-olds. So it takes a very trained and skilled and sophisticated teacher. And I saw that Dr. Soraya's, one of her points was that the limited understanding of teachers for a particular program. And it's the same in that notion of teachers are caught in the bind between doing teaching and being a teacher. Then the difference is when you're being a teacher, you understand those contexts. You understand more about who's in your class, especially if you want to manage the behavioural aspects of it and have people, engaged in the curriculum that you design. It's basically all they have control over. And because teachers in primary school have that full day, they can actually integrate things and contextualize them, not teach them in silos. So now we're doing English, now we're doing science. No, you actually to understand science, there's a form of literacy there as well as reading, formulas and things like that. So yeah, it's part of that. The way I believe that curriculum is designed, in addition to the way that schooling is designed, that it actually serves to perpetuate the orthodoxy of colonialism and now neoliberalism, that only a certain amount of people are actually meant to achieve, and others can achieve with some extra support and assistance. And then there are the others who realize very quickly, this place doesn't like me. I don't know why I would want to invest all of my time and effort here. That's my take on that.
Kamal, may I add a few
Yes.
points?
Yes, please.
Just to add what Dr. Karen mentioned earlier, it's not only the place in the context of oral RC children. The issue is not only the place doesn't like me. Sometimes in many cases, we also wonder if the place is safe enough for us. So emotionally, physically, so whether it is safe enough. I think we've had lots of cases that demonstrate that in some cases, some settings, schools are not safe enough for oral RC children, which is very sad. And to answer Tharani's question earlier, in the context of oral RC children, I would say, first of all, it's really important that we help teachers to understand the complexity of our oral RC students' language environment. And that also comes together with addressing any internalized bias or prejudice that teachers have. Because whatever prejudices, whatever biases that teachers have, that they may not be aware of those internalized prejudice, but these will actually inform and shape their teaching practices, their classroom practices. So, and also the way they interact with oral RC children or Indigenous children. And I know a lot of people, a lot of teachers who have the best intention for their oral RC students, but they misunderstand us, the oral RC, and they have these misconceptions and internalized biases and prejudices that no one has ever pointed out to them. So some were actually quite open about, talking about the internalized biases that they have. But this is a very, very delicate matter to discuss. And I think one of the ways, or one of the tools that we could use probably to encourage teachers to do more self-reflection activities, so that when they do self-reflection, when they are encouraged to reflect on their own practices, on their own thinking, in their own time, in their own personal space, so that they can be as transparent, as honest as possible, then they can actually have those biases or prejudices listed, and it's there. They can visualize it, and they know, oh, this is how I view my oral RC children. Because you can have the best curriculum, you can have the most culturally responsive curriculum, but at the end of the day, teachers are the ones who deliver the programs or the curriculums, and they come with certain understanding of their students and also certain beliefs that they will end up imposing intentionally or unintentionally. I think we all do that, you know. And also I think another important step that we have not done enough so far is to empower the Orang Asli communities itself, like, you know, to actually go and empower our Orang Asli parents, Orang Asli communities. I think this is what the community learning centers managed by Miss Janita Engi. I don't think she's here, but I think most of you are familiar with Miss Janita. She's done a great job in doing these community learning centers, managing these community learning centers, empowering the community members themselves. So imagine if the mothers or fathers could actually deliver up to a certain point, for example, in literacy programs. Yeah. So if the parents are equipped or are prepared to actually do this as well at home, then we can actually bridge the gap between the school and the home practices. Because a lot of at the moment we rely too much, or it's like we have really high confidence in the school's ability, which I won't deny this is true to some extent. We feel that the school is the only authority or the only all-knowing authority that will be able to deliver this, while the communities, the parents are not equipped, well equipped, are not trained enough, which is true, but this is what we should be addressing. So like the community learning centers that Ms. Janita is managing now, she's conducting the courses, and she's interacting with the community members, and she's actually helping the mothers, the fathers, the community members to actually read and write and actually deliver that program as well to their children. So then when parents, like, especially if my parents were able to do that, all right, were able to teach me some literacy skills at home, then when I don't get it, they will know how to actually, all right, let me put it in this way, right? Teachers may not have this knowledge, even though there are teachers who speak indigenous languages, right? But I must underscore here that some people think when you speak the language, you are culturally equipped to actually teach the students. Language is just one part of it. We can speak the language, but we may not understand, the lives of our students. So we speak the language, but we deliver the lessons, or we interact with our students with values that do not come from that particular environment. So three things: for teachers to understand the complexity of language environment, to address the biases and prejudice, and also to empower the community members. So that's all. Thank you, Kamal. Over to you.
Okay, actually, I've got a follow-up question from that. So how involved? Okay, so one, as Dr. Surya was talking about, involves taking children out of their villages and going to school, sometimes away from the community at a tender age of maybe 7. They live in hostels. So that's also another problem, right? Taking children at a very young age to live in hostels and to be raised by other people who may not be sensitized to their worldview as well, and also their quote-unquote culture. Okay, so how much of Indigenous peoples actually participate in the design of the curriculum that the government sets up? So Janita doesn't only teach, right? She also actually works to design curriculum that is tailored to the communities that she works with. She's come to codify some of this in curriculums. So both in Australia and in Malaysia, how do they engage Indigenous people to develop the programs that are targeting Indigenous literacy? Dr. Surya or Dr. Karen?
Mine is very quick. They don't, or they do in a very tokenistic way, or they really marginalize it to what I call, in a very cheeky way, the moments of boomerang, clapsticks and didgeridoo. So those iconic stereotypical representations of Aboriginal people and what they, so yeah, that's, and it's been that way since I went to school. That's one of the things I want to see change in 20 years and definitely 100 years.
So despite the as you mentioned just now that things have improved, a large part of it is still very much colonial or outside.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Surya?
I think it's quite similar here as well. Like in the case of Miss Janita, I think Janita would be the best person to share more. But from what I know, that it is only recently that her work has actually been acknowledged by the Ministry of Education. Before this, they wouldn't even, they wouldn't give the credit, like they wouldn't give the support that she deserved, because it is not coming from the ministry. But that has changed. I think it takes time, and I can see that the government agencies in general are opening now, but there are still it is still a long way to go. And like Dr. Karen mentioned earlier, yes, most of the times Orang Asli scholars or Orang Asli academics are invited because they need a representative. So they need a representative there. So they invited us, and often programs at schools as well will, for example, in my case, they want me to speak about me, to tell students to be like me. I said, no, I'm not going to talk about me. We are going to talk about the students, what they need. And the students do not need to be like me, because we are all different. And, making one person like the only model for all students, that's not correct. But so far that's been happening, but I can see that things are changing now, which is great. But it will take time for that to really turn into something more positive. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? I think we can take at least one or two more questions.
There's a question.
Oh, Gurpreet, sorry. Yeah. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Gurpreet, postgraduate student at School of Education at Taylor's. Okay, so as I have this question, like as we are aware, there are many programs and practices that have been implemented for this Orang Asli community globally. So what are some of the ways of measuring success of these programs and services, and how do we actually make sure that these measures are really meaningful for these indigenous communities?
Perhaps we can start with Dr. Surya.
Yes, that's an interesting question actually that you asked there, because I am now in the middle of writing about inclusive education for Orang Asli students, and then it's interesting to see that everybody talks about inclusive education for Orang Asli children, but we have not clearly defined what inclusive education for Orang Asli children should look like or would look like. We keep talking inclusive, but we don't know what are the indicators that we need to use in order to say, okay, this is inclusive. And what is inclusive in the first place? So to answer your question just now, I think we need to involve the communities in the process, in the planning process more, so that we can actually hear from the communities what they are actually experiencing. So from there, we can actually, we will come up with something that is really useful or needed for the communities, rather than just saying, we want inclusive education for you. Inclusive education means that you need to be able to integrate yourself in the mainstream society, which is not the case for Orang Asli students. And a lot of time we talk about integration, but we are actually doing, what we are doing is actually assimilation. So, which is very, very bad for our Orang Asli children. So we need to involve more Orang Asli communities. And by Orang Asli communities, I do not only mean like Orang Asli academics or Orang Asli scholars or the Tok Batin. Oftentimes when we say we want to talk to Orang Asli communities, we go to the leaders, this is great. Of course, this is great. You talk to Tok Batin or the leaders, that's great. But we don't talk to the Orang Asli individuals in the communities who are not the leaders in the community, who are, we do not talk to them enough. Whereas oftentimes they are the ones who are experiencing this even more than, you know, in my case, for example, my situations have changed, right? I'm sharing my experiences from 20, 30 years ago in school, and which sadly are still, are still happening happening to my Orang Asli children. I have a son. My son doesn't have to go through the same struggle because of, you know, because I have got out from that circle, but also that cycle, sorry. But then if we only listen to like the so-called educated Orang Asli, and then the leaders who are actually economically more advantaged than the other Orang Asli people, then we don't have the full picture of the struggle. So I think we need to involve more community members. Yeah.
And also we lose out the voice from women. Orang Asli women tend to be to not be included. Dr. Karen, perhaps you can also, how's the experience in Australia with evaluating, assessing the success of policy?
In Australia, it comes down to two things: attendance. So you can attend, but you might not be learning, and then it comes down to academic outcomes in general. But my signal just cut out, and I've just come back in, and I want to encourage that one of the capabilities that First Peoples have is to be able to see through the layers. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that when we don't pay enough attention to what these language means and these English terms mean, then we could be at risk at applying different definitions because of our own embodiedness and our own experiences. So that term inclusive will mean something for the policy people. It will mean something different for the teachers. It will mean something different for the students, and it will mean something different for the parents and the communities. Now that's not that. So there's a First Peoples way of defining what is usually meant when it's inclusive. We let you in, right? But when it's considered from those whole range of those contexts, then we've got to find a way of having those multiple sources, or that constellation, if I can, use the word that I'm going to, live, love, and enjoy for the rest of my time after this meeting, is that we recognize them as a constellation, and we look at each of the stars, as Dr. Soraya did, and we understand their relationship, and we understand their implications. But we also understand that at one point in time, we might start with one particular group, but that should not stay that way. It should not start, begin, and finish with one particular group, say the school, or even the parents, or even the students. It's got to be that constellation. But I really want to urge you, as my elders urged me, pay attention to those English language terms, because they have their own magic and their own mystery, and you might be using them, but you might be using them in a way that actually helps their agenda, not our own. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karen. So I guess to summarize, I mean, there's so many things that were said here. We've already come to the end of our program, of our forum. So perhaps we need to recognize Indigenous epistemology. Would that be one of it, Karen? And how we look at it. We need to, I can't read my own handwriting. We need to involve communities in planning, design. But I think a huge thing that has come up also that has not actually been vocalized is this issue of trust. And I think that's what you put it so well in the message from your elders. So really, in moving towards in reforming formal education, we really need to recognize there is a deficit of trust, and that trust is not unfounded. It comes from a history of appropriation and being marginalized. So perhaps there's something ministries of education in both countries, educationists, and other stakeholders need to consider. The relationship is never value free. Yeah. So perhaps I'll pass this back to Hema.
Thank you so much, Kamal. I think I wanted to ask a few questions, but I thought I'll just let other people ask. And I know I'm aware that we've run out of time, but just one thing from me. I think when we talk about education for vulnerable populations, Indigenous children, other vulnerable populations, we always talk in isolation. We talk about the children, or we talk about the curriculum, or we talk about teacher, and then we exclude other things. And we never look at the whole picture, because the child is part of this entire system. It's a systemic problem that we're not addressing. It's not just the curriculum problem or teacher problem. And there's the teacher education we never seem to quite talk about. In Malaysia, for example, all beginning teachers get mostly get sent to rural areas, but somehow teacher education never cover how to teach children in rural places. So that's a problem there as well. So the problems are multi-layered, it's compounded, and I think we need to look at them as a whole in order for us to look at children from vulnerable populations. Having said that, thank you ever so much for joining us today, Karen, Surya, and Kamal, and everyone else. I hope there are some takeaways here for teachers, for educators, on what we can do with children from vulnerable populations in our own classes. So thank you ever so much once again.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Surya. Thank you, Karen. And thanks, Dr. Logan, as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for taking a Saturday time to be with us. Thanks, Surya, Karen, Kamal, Hema.
And Sean for organizing this as well.
Oh, yeah. My fellow neighbor, Sean.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Hasta la vista.